Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 2 cheat sheet. We're one game week into FPL. I think there's absolutely no need to overreact. A lot of the picks that we thought were good for Game Week 1 are still going to be good for Game Week 2. I know there's a lot of new managers out there, so if you're watching the cheat sheet for the first time, it's effectively a series where we look at the best picks per position and per price point. The whole idea is to ensure that we kind of get an updated understanding of the current landscape, and now that game week 1 is passed, we're looking towards the next 3 to 5, maybe even 6 fixtures, evaluating a lot of the historical stats for players and sort of contextualizing them within the current landscape. So that's the idea here in game week 2. The biggest impact, I suppose, now is just the reaction to some of the early minutes for players who might have had dicey minutes, right? I'm not talking about your Brunos of the world. I'm talking about players like Nkunku, my thoughts on him, and some other sort of key picks that have become a huge topic of interest over the week. Starting with the midfield, we have Rodgers and Ahmad. Rodgers is definitely an amazing pick. And I think, if I'm being completely honest, the 90 minutes were great, but we also have to contextualize that Watkins was an early sub and he was a pre planned sub because he didn't have a preseason. It does make a lot of sense that in the future, Rodgers' minutes will probably get a little bit worse. But the fact that he's actually getting entrusted with such great minutes, whereas someone like Bailey, for example, is an earlier substitution, is just an amazing. So Rodgers is definitely a pick that I'm still looking forward to. And I think he's always a great option because he's so attractive as a transfer for Game Week 3 for most managers. And it often just is a simple downgrade from any other midfielder in the game. So that's why Rodgers is so powerful. Amad Diallo, I still have to tier as a differential. No changes here. And that's simply because I think he could once again start in Game Week 2, but the minutes will be dicey once again. He's an early substitution. I probably would not recommend keeping Ahmad in the team if you actually own someone like Ahmad. I do think that, as I mentioned in the previous video, he was very much fit for the purpose of potentially a bench boost one at best. But that's sort of my thoughts on Ahmad Diallo. In the 5.5 position, there hasn't been too many changes. And the one change I think is that Murphy has dropped, because it's not just the fact that Murphy was an early substitution. That was very clearly a game state related substitution. But it's the idea that he is one of the first few players within this Newcastle team to definitely lose his minutes, right? If we think about priority, if we think about pecking order, he's definitely someone who's going to have less minutes than any of the other attackers. And I think Gordon and Isak usually have extremely safe minutes. So what I expect to see in the future is, even though Murphy might continue starting, we'll probably see Barnes come on and then Gordon shift towards the right-hand side in the future, which will definitely reduce Murphy's minutes. You'll also notice that a lot of Newcastle players will probably drop in the cheat sheet a little bit because, of course, you've just come through their best fixture in a great run, right, which is Southampton at home. As far as the other picks, Andreas is the key mover here. Yes, it seems like Andreas could still very much leave the club, but they've also signed Sandra Berg, and that probably actually indicates that Andreas is leaving. However, I still have to say that for the purposes of Game Week 2, he's definitely an interesting option. It doesn't seem like there's been too much, let's say, within the direction of Andreas leaving, since Marseille probably posted one of their initial offers to Fulham. So if he stays, he's actually going to be a great pick. Because we know that he's on a lot of set pieces. He could still have a small amount of pen share, even though he's behind Lukic, at least in the pecking order. But I have to give him a rise here. He just has a great run of games starting now, and that's pretty much it. As far as, let's say, other picks, I'm still very high on Minte and Semenyo. I've been high on Semenyo actually even from my first draft, if you guys remember. And I think his minutes have always been very strong. So no real qualms there. With Minte, it seems like the concussion is not genuine, as in he doesn't have a concussion, but it seemed like there was a miscommunication with the doctor, or at least that is the angle that Minte and his agents are going for right now. So we'll see what happens in terms of his minutes, particularly when it comes to, let's say, the assessment of medical situations like that. But I think he's going to be the starting right wing for the time being, and I think he looked brilliant even in his 45 minutes effectively of football. With Smith Rowe, yes, of course, he's building fitness, but it's the same situation as Andreas, where the true run of games for Fulham have started, and so he's a great pick. With players like Hudson-Odoi and Kamara, still not that interested in them. For Hudson-Odoi, once again, it goes back to me not being so confident in Nottingham Forest's attack. The only player that I've ever been really confident in, since we knew that Gibbs White might have lost some of his set pieces, which didn't actually seem like the case, right? We saw him take set pieces in the previous match, and so I still think that it's really wood or bust. But we now know that Nottingham Forest are also investing into more additions within the attack, and we've also seen some earlier substitutions for Wood. And so that's why I'm not high on Hudson-Odoi. But the run of games still is good for the next 2 game weeks. As far as someone like Kamada, I spoke previously about how I think that he's still very easily going to be an early substitution. And it's very clear now that the substitution is either going to be Sar or Ayu. I spoke about that previously as well. A lot of people doubted that, but you just have to look at Kamada's minutes, even going back to when he played under Glasner in the Bundesliga. He is not someone who's going to be playing 90 minutes a game, and I think you should just expect that. At 5.5, that might just be enough, but I definitely probably wouldn't have him in my team because I just don't see the upside there, considering that Eze is going to play most of the football, given that his release clause has expired. At the 6.5 million position, people are going to find this controversial because I haven't immediately dropped in Nkunku and Bailey. Now, I think that the reality is with Bailey, he's one of those players where we do actually expect him always to be an early substitution. But as long as he's playing 75 minutes a game, I still think he's a very valuable pick because when you look at the underlying stats, they're very good. And so even if you contextualize them in terms of, let's say, reducing them by the actual minutes that he plays, I still think he's a great pick because Aston Villa's run of games still in the short term after game week 2 are just amazing. As far as Nkunku, yes, 58 minutes versus Man City is very, very bad. I don't think I am going to overstep the mark in terms of Nkunku. Yes, I own Nkunku in my team, but that doesn't mean I'm necessarily biased. I would say that I want to see how Chelsea operate versus a team like Wolves and see if they play, once again, 3 center mids, right? Do we see Caicedo, Lavia, and Enzo play again? If we do, then of course Nkunku has to drop. He might even drop 2 tiers. But yes, we know that João Felix is coming in. I see him as a little bit more of a centre forward option, and I really want to see how Nkunku's minutes are going to play out and what position he'll play in Wolves before I actually seriously consider downgrading him. Because the worst thing that I think we could do right now is sort of sell the picture that Nkunku's a completely dud asset as soon as game week 1 because of one game being played versus Man City, the best team in the league. So those are my thoughts on Nkunku. I just don't want to overshoot the mark. As far as the other players here in this sort of price point, the only player that I think I'll call out is probably Garnacho and Sobo. Because Garnacho, I think you can definitely argue that he's someone who probably deserves to drop. I would say that I find that Garnacho should be in the default starting 11 for Man City, or Man United rather, as long as he's 100% fit. It seems like Ahmad has played well enough in the preseason and well enough within the game so far to actually continue starting. But I think as soon as game week 2 or 3, we're probably going to see Garnacho back in the starting lineup, and I think things are going to change. So if you're someone who's actually holding Garnacho and considering whether you should drop him, I still think you should see out game week 2, and then you can reassess when he plays Liverpool, for example, so that you can kind of see what the situation is with Ahmad's minutes. I might be wrong in terms of, let's say, how low I am on Ahmad, and maybe Ahmad continues starting, and therefore that makes Garnacho a lot worse of a pick. But I also, once again, as I said, don't want to overstep the mark there. As far as Sobo, I think what is nice about Sobo's situation is simply Liverpool look like a great team. Potentially, it was an error for me to sort of put him in that differential bracket. I don't necessarily see him as a green pick. I don't think he's nearly as explosive as any of the other picks here. But I think the reality is that Liverpool are still a great team and he's still at a decent enough price point to be considered. Do I think he's an amazing pick? I would still say no, but that's sort of my opinion on Sobo. It's not like he's going to be, I think, in consistently great positions like a Luis Diaz, a Jota, or a Salah, for example. We look at the current starting front 3, but that's sort of my thoughts. As far as, let's say, someone like Mitoma, I've just added him to the cheat sheet. Brighton look pretty good so far. Yes, I think the result was sort of a bit flattering for Brighton. Nice run of fixtures starting from game week 4, really, for Brighton. But given that their performances already look quite good, and we know that they've always had a strong team, but potentially lacked in a bit of a midfield, going back to, let's say, last season when they were definitely struggling with injuries and also particularly with their defense, I think that we shouldn't overshoot, let's say, where we think Brighton are as a team. Keep in mind that one of the things that goes against a player like Matoma is unfortunately the underlying stats aren't perfect, but we can definitely, I think, foresee that Brighton will look like a very strong attacking team and that his minutes are probably better than some of the other Brighton attackers, which immediately makes him an interesting pick. What I will say though is I'm still a lot higher on just trying to utilize the value of a player like Minte or João Pedro within the draw structure, although I can definitely concede that Matoma might be the better asset if you didn't consider price. As far as Brennan Johnson, I think he has to drop. I didn't get the chance to sort of react to a lot of the Tottenham transfer news that has happened since the last cheat sheet. We've heard about the Odegaard signing, for example. I just think that there's just going to be too much sort of mins issues with players like Brennan Johnson. I've always been very low on Kulusevski. You guys know that. I was not really surprised to see him bench for game week 1. And I've taken him off of the cheat sheet entirely. At the 7.0 position, what we have here is a rise for Mbumo. He's going to have pen share, and that's going to be an extremely scary world to live without Mbumo. Fortunately, he does play Liverpool away, so the next fixture where I'm really worried about Mbumo is game week 3, and it's very likely that I'll be missing out on someone like Mbumo because unfortunately that's followed up by Man City away. So he doesn't have the best fixtures, week to week, but as soon as game week 6 happens, we should have the information of whether Tony is actually going to be staying at Brentford or whether he's finally going to sort of secure that Saudi move, which seems to be very, very close as per the reports of Fabrizio. So I think Mboum was just going to be an amazing pick in FPL. Already started the season off great. I'm not just reacting to that. It's just the case that when you actually have probably better positional share, better penalty share as well, someone like Mboum is immediately going to be a better fantasy pick, and that's very obvious. In the 7.5 position, I've dropped Gordon. And this is not an indictment on Gordon's minutes, but it's just the reality where, as I said, for me, Gordon is a pick you go for because you think that his minutes are secure in game week 1. I would have preferred Jota, and I think I answered that on the live stream. But Gordon's fixtures do get slightly worse, right? When you come off your best fixture and you haven't had the chance to return, but we also knew that the preseason minutes were a little bit doubtful, so therefore he was probably an early substitution no matter the game state. Gordon is also just going to drop now heading into somewhat tougher fixtures when you look at the fixture run ahead. And so that's why Gordon drops. Bowen, Luis Diaz, I think with Bowen, it's still more a case of waiting for some of the worst fixtures to sort of come and go. You can see actually, for example, Crystal Palace and Man City, I actually see them as still two really tough fixtures back to back. And so it's really after that where we can consider Bowen as a pick. When it comes to players like Luis Diaz, I'm still a little bit low on him because I think that he is someone who could probably also get subbed off a little earlier. We're seeing less involvement in game week 1 from some of the players who weren't involved in the preseason, but I think as the fixtures go on for Liverpool, we'll probably see less minutes for Jota and less minutes for Diaz. That's my thought right now, but it could very well change. And so that's sort of just my take. I don't want to overreact to, let's say, the great minutes that all the Liverpool attackers had in game week 1 because we know that that can very well change in a different game, in a different situation. As far as, let's say, Madison, I think he had a great assist, arguably for game week 1, but then the question is whether you still want to go for a player like Madison in the team. He's still on a lot of set pieces, still going to be an early substitution, I feel, in most games for that Spurs play. And I think the thing that makes me a little bit low on players like Madison and ultimately also Son is that I don't think that Spurs are that incredible as a team, if that makes sense, in terms of whether they actually have players that continuously benefit from certain opportunities. I think the only player I can probably say that is Solanke from just watching the Leicester game. I feel like a lot of the share is actually divided attack wise with some of the fullbacks. And so that takes away from, I guess, how important some of the attackers are in the system. We've mentioned previously in the past that Brennan Johnson has great underlying stats. I don't think you can necessarily say that for some of the other players within this Tottenham team. And I think Madison also suffers from that to an extent. Because when you look at some of the comparative players here in this list, it's not necessarily like he's in a sort of category of his own, and his minutes are actually worse than a player like, for example, Anthony Gordon. So at the 8.5 position, I've dropped Odegaard. And this is simply just to reflect, I think, the tougher run of games that Arsenal have. I have nothing against Odegaard, but I generally just think that Saka is the 100% penalty taker of the team. And because of that, I think that that takes away from a little bit of Odegaard's theoretical ceiling as a fantasy pick. You've also come over, let's say, the Wolves at home game, which I think also applies to Bruno. But what I would still say is that I still hold Bruno in a slightly higher regard compared to Odegaard. And that might change in the future if we start to see, for example, Bruno's positioning also get worse when players come back into the team. But for now, that's sort of just my general expectation between those two players. And it's very close still. At the 9.5 to 10.5 position, we have a couple of changes. And the main change really is we have a drop from Son and a rise for Foden and also a rise for KDB. Now, one of the issues that's going to come up with the sort of change in system for Man City is, what is exactly going to happen with a lot of the players within Man City? I think with the Bob injury, you can argue that there's one less attacker that really needs to compete for minutes. But then you also have players like Bernardo, like Doku and Savio, who will be competing for minutes. Not necessarily in the same positions though, because Bernardo is now someone who's going to be a little bit more interior. And the issue is with Foden coming back in, someone still has to play almost a wide role within the team. And I think that helps the minutes generally of everyone within the team. But then the question is whether you'll see, let's say, a KDB, for example, play a little bit deeper and things like that. So I do think that Man City is a weird team to assess right now. The mins could be a little bit over the place, as I think Pep will sort of trial this sort of, or spearhead rather, this new change. I think the wingers are crucial to the system, but whether they're actually good FPL picks, I'm not quite sure right now if I'd jump the boat on those players, which is why you don't see me recommend players necessarily like Bernardo, like Doku, or like Savio right now. But I think for the people who actually are listening to this video and actually generally do like taking punts on certain players and based on, let's say, a perceived change in tactics, then I think there's definitely a couple Man City options that are actually very interesting for a lot of players. So it comes down to what your thoughts are, but I do think right now at least you have an opportunity to benefit from someone like Bernardo in the short term. But do I really like the mins enough? I don't think so. And I think the same applies to, unfortunately, Doku and also Savio as well. So that's why I don't feature these players. I think Foden coming back into the team just means that his minutes will be nailed and some other players will have to lose minutes as a result, which we could see as well within the previous match. And so that's why Foden is on the cheat sheet. That's why KDB is on the cheat sheet. But I can't really say the same for someone like, let's say, even Bernardo, who can also play a wide array of roles for the team, which might even be somewhat more defensive roles. And that's sort of the overall sort of thoughts I have on Man City. Quite a long one there, but I just think that it's not really worth going for the gamble of players who will have very variable minutes game to game. You might get it completely right for the Ipswich at home game, but that also could force another future transfer for yourself. With Son, I have to say I've probably mentioned that I'm very low on Son when he's a left winger when it comes to FPL. I think the one game versus Leicester away isn't going to change my mind on Son, but the reality is the run of games are getting worse because you're getting closer to that Arsenal fixture, and ultimately it still seems a lot more appetizing now in this FPL landscape to own players like Foden and Saka for the time being, definitely Palmer as well. So that's sort of my thoughts on Son and as to why he's dropped. With Salah, no changes there. I think he just looks like an incredible pick, as he always has been. In the forward position, I've scrapped all the 4.5 forwards. I just think it's a boring discussion because there's no one who's really on my mind. In the 5.5 position, yes, of course, João Pedro and Armstrong played a lot of minutes and they did nothing. Armstrong, particularly in a 10 versus 11, but let's be honest, I think a lot of people immediately would gravitate towards Ben Burton Diaz, but it's not like he did something within that game. I think Armstrong had plenty of underlying stats within that game, obviously within a very specific game state, but I'm overall quite confident in Armstrong because at the end of the day, you still have a couple fallback options like things like penalties and good minutes, generally speaking. So no changes on those players there. With Vardy, it seems like he was fit. I did actually genuinely question whether he was actually going to be out for multiple weeks, which I believe Steve Cooper definitely lied about, to the press. I didn't remove Vardy from the previous cheat sheet. He turned out to be fine. He also scored a goal, which was actually a bit shocking, to be honest, because I think it's just so impressive to see a player who is of such a veteran age still being able to do it at the top league in the world. So congrats to Vardy on that goal. Is he a great FPL option? Given that Duck has actually gone for a while, I think I have to say that Vardy's actually a very, very interesting pick for the time being. As far as Welbeck, he actually had a great game last time out, but I still think that in terms of the pecking order, even though Welbeck has such a great game, that I think João Pedro will probably still take more centre forward minutes in the future when some of the new signings come into the team. And so that's sort of my general concern with Welbeck and why I'm a little bit lower on him for now. At the 6.0 position, no changes in terms of my thoughts on players. Yes, of course, we're starting to close into, week by week, less probably Chris Wood minutes. And if they sign another player like Nketiah, which seems to be the current rumor of a Nottingham Forest striker signing as of late, then yes, that makes Wood worse as a pick. But we've always said that the underlying stats are incredible. Muniz just has an amazing game on paper with Leicester at home and generally just a good run of games. With Calvert-Lewin, the minutes are still a little bit low for my liking, so I've dropped him. And Cunha, I've risen after, of course, he's gone through an incredibly tough fixture, which is Arsenal. Cunha didn't actually start in that game, but I think that we'll see him starting in the future, and generally speaking, he'll become an interesting pick. I don't know whether he starts necessarily for the Chelsea game, but I think it's a good time to sort of recognize the value that Cunha has as well. As far as the 7.0 position, No changes from Fulkrug. It seems like he's going to have a little bit of a slower onboarding process in the league. His minutes might be variable. Not entirely sure as well if the pen share is fully there because it seems like Paqueta will take pens, I would say, but over Fulkrug, but that remains to be seen because I'm not sure in the preseason if I saw when Fulkrug took a penalty if Paqueta was on the pitch as well. So we'll see. As far as, let's say, Solanke, I still think he looked brilliant. The minutes were actually a lot higher than I expected. Richarlison was also back, which is, I think, is a big positive news. Is it necessarily the case that Solanke will be a 90-minute player for the whole season? I actually generally doubt that. I think it was a little bit game state spurred as well, because of course Spurs were definitely chasing for a goal, so there's no real reason to actually take off a center forward in that situation. You just play effectively two up top there with Richarlison as well, and Richarlison was very close to scoring. But we'll see what happens with Solanke. I think that the big question mark once again is going to be on pen share. Some people would disagree as to how you evaluate pen share because they look historically at penalties received, which I think is completely the wrong way to go about it. Because you can go back to previous seasons where Tottenham actually had a genuinely fair amount of penalties, and I think that's totally fine. As far as, let's say, Mateta, I think we mentioned that I expected him to start in game week 1. I think that his minutes will only really go up going forward. So Mateta is definitely a great pick, and you're starting with West Ham at home now if you have the opportunity to move into him. As far as some of the other picks here in the forward positions, no changes really, and that includes Watkins as well. Right, the reality is he's still playing Arsenal next. I would only ever consider Watkins as a transfer for game week 3 at this point in time. And I definitely wouldn't be moving off of even players like, let's say, Havertz or Isak up until at least game week 4 or game week 5. Because look, the fixtures for Isak are not necessarily as good as the fixtures for Watkins starting from game weeks 3 and 4. But overall, I think they're good enough. When you look at, let's say, Tottenham at home plus Wolves away, I just think that a lot of managers are going to struggle to actually move into Watkins unless they really actually want to go out of Holland. And if you're going out of Holland, then yes, of course, there's an opportunity for you to move out as soon as maybe even game week 3 if you really want to do so. But do you really want to do so? Is probably another question. As far as the defense this time around, we don't have too many changes. I think the 4.0 just simply has to be readjusted as a category. I was quite shocked to actually see the Barco benching. That was actually contrary to my beliefs. I don't think I was as high as Barco as other players because I actually ended up with an FPL draft without Barco. And you guys saw sort of how I changed my draft from the updated draft to the final team selection. But Barco being benched was a bit of a shock to me. That's with Estupiñán not even being a part of the team. So he just has to drop immediately, and so does Johnson. I've kept players that I think will be nailed as 4.0 players. Mosquera, who had a wild performance versus Arsenal, won't even comment on it. But FaZe and Harvard Bella sort of nailed options. So great picks there. In the 4.5 position, given my respects back to Robinson, I do think he deserved to be a green pick even as of last week, so apologies for missing that out, I suppose. He's definitely an interesting pick here where I think he's picked exclusively because you think he's a good attacker, very much in the Poro lens of things, compared to some of the other picks here who actually play for much better defenses. So that's sort of my thoughts still on Fulham. They have a lovely game here in Game Week 2. It's a great Robinson game. If people are considering a transfer and need a nailed 4.5 player, Robinson probably is the go-to player outside of players like Dunk and Konze, who I think hold out really well over the same sort of run of games. Lewis, I've also given a gigantic rise to, and that's simply because I think Lewis only applies to very specific FPL managers who have a lot of depth, like myself, within their team, but actually want to capture the upside of a starting fixture here in maybe Ipswich at home, right? Because, yes, of course, Walker is back, Stones is technically back as well, but the role that Rico Lewis is currently playing is quite different to, I think, what you can expect Walker to be able to do, traditionally speaking. So I see Rico Lewis as getting another start. But does he get more than that is probably a very fair question. And does Pep set up differently in some of the games to come ahead before the Champions League? I think that's very probable. So Rico Lewis is definitely a risk. But then you also have to say that you don't ever really often get someone who plays such an expansive role for such a great defense, for such a great price. And that's what Rico Lewis represents. But I think he's definitely a player that I would caution to go against if you don't have a deep enough defense in the time being. As far as some of the other 4.5 picks, we've added Mazraoui, Mikolenko, we've dropped. I just generally think that my expectations for teams like Everton and Nottingham Forest have dropped a little bit, even when it comes to defense. Yes, the underlying stats for these teams were quite good last season, but I don't think that we've necessarily seen improvement from these teams, even though we've had some good signings. Right, Milenkovic is a good example of that, but right now with Brantford being injured, you also probably are a little bit low on Everton as well. So that's generally just where my thoughts are on some of these picks. With Martinez, I've sort of risen him up. I don't think it was necessarily fair for me to maybe keep him as a sort of orange pick. Maybe we'll see some worse sort of defensive performances from Man United in the time to come. But I think generally speaking, this is probably a season where we're sort of expecting that Man United will play much better as a defense compared to where they were last season. And that was sort of 16th in the league when it comes to expected goals conceded. The big thing, as I said, when I compare to some of the other teams, is that Man United have noticeably made some improvements on their defense, whereas other teams have probably stagnated or unfortunately sold big players as that were a key part of their defense. So that's why also we have some of the other changes here. In the 5.0 position, I was quite shocked to see Udogi start. So that was actually great and fantastic news. I think that's something that not of a lot of us FPL managers expected because he had very light preseason minutes. And so Udogi being back is very nice. I still think that Poro's positions are absolutely ridiculous, and they're definitely still better than Udogi's general positioning. So that's why I think I have a separation there of Poro and Udogi. But Poro, obviously, huge asterisks on him now because of the potential injury situation. Certainty there. Kukure has been added, but there's also an uncertainty there, which is why we have an asterisk. I think some people can consider Gusto, but I think the question to be asked is what you think will happen if someone like Reece James will come back into the team in a few weeks. Do you want to be owning Gusto then or Kukurea? I probably don't want to be owning either, but I think if I had to pick one, I'd probably pick Kukurea for the time being. As far as the 5.5 price point, I've also given Akanji a rise. I think when you're looking at a better run of games now, getting that Chelsea fixture out of the way, even though it actually looked extremely routine and easy for Man City, Akanji is probably the pick that I actually like the most in the 5.5 position for the Man City defender. So that's why I've given him a rise. No real changes here in the 6.0 position other than a major rise as well for Robertson, right? We were definitely a little bit shaky in terms of whether Robertson was actually going to start for game week one, but the fact that he has just makes me really confident in him as a pick, at least until the Champions League fixture starts. So that's why I think Robertson is just a great pick and why he rises all the way towards the top now that we actually know that he's going to be starting in games for the foreseeable future. As far as some of the other picks, you can even argue that maybe Gabriel deserves a bit of a drop because you've actually come over, let's say, a Wolves at home game, and now you have a few tougher games in the future for Arsenal. They were also somewhat close to losing their clean sheet, bar some great Raya saves. So that's sort of the context in terms of the premium defenders. I just think that a lot of people who actually own Gabriel or White or even Saliba will find it quite hard to actually sell some of these players unless you actually really want to jump onto someone like Robertson in the meantime. But it's still an absolutely elite defense, which Arsenal promises to be. No changes in my expectations of a team like Arsenal. As far as the goalkeeping positions, I've actually decided that there are no changes this week. So the goalkeeping cheat sheet is exactly as it was. And that's simply because I really don't have a huge sort of vastly different opinion on any of these teams or any of these players. I think, if anything, Sanchez's spot in the team might be a little bit shaky, which is why the asterisk still remains in place for him. But other than that, I'm very happy with how the goalkeepers are situated. It was nice to see the premium goalkeepers actually all get their clean sheets. And that's pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for watching the Game Week 2 cheat sheet. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon for some more content.